Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. My name is Joshua Gibson. I am your forever host because I don't ever foresee myself leaving the podcast or having someone fulfill my position. Today I'm joined by Claire Zai. So one of the reasons for this, and it's been a thought I've had for a long time, and we had Greg Knuckles on the Weightlifting House podcast recently, I'd say maybe a few months back, to talk about gender differences with respect to resistance training. But I don't think we touched into one of the biggest differences, which is the menstrual cycle, because men obviously don't experience that to any degree, and a lot of people, a lot of women specifically, have questions about how that would influence training or affect training, if there are any considerations that should be taken into account beforehand or during the programming process. And Claire has been running this little, like, I guess, series on Instagram detailing the entirety of it, and how you can take it into consideration when you are programming for yourself or for female clients. And with that being said, without trying to, trying to detail the entire episode, Claire, how are you today? Where are you exactly for people who are listening?
Yeah, I'm great. I'm currently located down in San Diego. So,
is that the Barbell Medicine headquarters? Because I know Jordan lives down there.
Jordan also lives down here. It is just a happy coincidence that we both happen to live in the same city. I moved here first, and I always tell him that he followed me, which isn't true. He didn't know it existed, but that's the running joke.
Yeah. So I would be interested in hearing, though, how you did end up, I guess, moving to San Diego and then connecting with Jordan and coming on to the Barbell Medicine team.
Yeah. So I started powerlifting when I was in my master's, and this has relevance, I promise. So I started powerlifting when I was in my master's and kind of caught the bug, and I had a friend who was programming for me, and I left the University of Colorado after I finished my master's and moved to San Diego for my job that was at the time with the Navy. And I was researching or helping with research that looked at persons with severe trauma to their lower limbs. Mm-hmm. So that was my like 9 to 5. And I was still powerlifting when I got here and was looking for a new coach. And I ended up finding Barbell Medicine and joined their group programming. And so I stuck with their group programming for about a year. And then once I qualified for USAPL Nationals, I was like, okay, maybe I need to hire like a coach. And so at that point, that was around the time that Jordan was actually moving to San Diego. And I was like, would you program for me? And he was like, yeah, sure, that's fine. Because we were lifting at the same gym. Mm-hmm. And it was just a convenient, easy transition. And then from there, I worked with Jordan. He's been coaching me now for almost 2 years. Mm-hmm. Yeah, almost 2 years now. And through that time, like, we got to know each other. He always was a big advocate of me starting my own small business and pushed me to do that. And then after a while, my little Bullseye Strength company was absorbed by Barbell Medicine and now is just been completely absorbed. And I just work for BBM doing the same stuff. Just I don't have to do any of the back end. Yeah. Somebody else does it for me. So.
Sure. And it would be interesting to hear about your time in that master's program, specifically because you study a single topic and you give it a lot of time and dedication. So what exactly was that in? And then we can talk about the transition into what you were looking at with respect to people with traumatic lower limb injuries.
Yeah. So the lab I worked in grad school was also a traumatic limb injury lab. It was more of a sports performance lab. So the lab as a whole, the goal was to help persons with amputations compete at high levels and learn about how having an amputation affects sports performance, usually running. They're now doing a lot of long jumping work. So they've worked with many Olympians who have been trying to go to the Olympics, not the Paralympics. And so my role in that lab was actually, I worked with healthy individuals and I was studying the metabolic effects of mass and weight when walking up a hill. So when you walk, you have to use energy to support your weight and you have to use energy to move you forward. And I was trying to figure out, when you walk up and down hills, how much of that energy is being used for each of those tasks. So I ended up torturing 10 poor souls on a treadmill for a year, and determined that we use like, I think it was 27 and 48% respectively to like moving your weight forward and holding yourself up. So when going uphill, it's much more complicated
Sure.
and hard to describe without anything more. But I studied walking, and that was to help with powered prostheses. For individuals who use powered prostheses, we need to know like how much energy is being used, both moving up and down and moving forward.
So I guess what's the relationship there? Is it just so that they have a similar like supply of energy, or like so it lasts a certain length of time, or like
both? Yeah.
Okay.
So it's both timing and amount and duration of that energy or power that the individual needs. Because if you think about a regular prosthesis, it doesn't have any, it's all elastic energy. So it's basically a spring attached to the end of the leg, where when you have a powered prosthesis, there's external power coming from a battery, like we have external power coming from our metabolism to power that ankle, which significantly reduces energy expenditure in some individuals. So
yeah, and I guess to predate that a little bit more, how exactly did you become interested in like similar topics and then get into that program? Because I guess asking that question, I thought it'd be so much of a straightforward answer, but it seems kind of complicated and interesting too.
Yeah, so I've been interested in sports my whole life. I keep trying to tell myself I'm not interested in sports because there's no money in sports, and I can't convince myself of this. I just keep circling back. But I was interested in sports. I really liked working with the amputee population. They're amazing people. They have the coolest stories, and helping them is really rewarding. And so I found this lab. The advisor at the time, I found her and I connected with her. Her name's Alina Grabowski, and she let me like work in her lab as an undergrad. And I worked in her lab for 3 years before I did my master's with her. She was basically like, I want you for your senior year, I want you to write a paper. And I was like, if I'm going to write a paper, I want a master's. And she was like, okay. And I challenged her, and I was like, oh crap, I didn't think you were going to say yes. So I kind of dared myself into a master's, and then I did like a 1-year accelerated master's program.
Yeah. Has that at all influenced the way you interact with and consider programming for people who aren't in that same population?
No. So now I use none of the knowledge that I have from that experience, except for being able to read research and write it in a easily digestible way. So I can write to science people, and I can write to Gen Pop, which I think Alina did a very good job of teaching me that. But what that research did teach me is that I like working with people. And so doing the like research in the lab is what I like the best. And that is the most similar to coaching. So
yeah. When did you get into more like powerlifting style training? You said you were into sports, but what was your like actual, it's always kind of weird to say like athletic career when it's in like a more of a strength sport, but what was like your athletic or athlete trajectory kind of up until this point?
So I started my athletic career or trajectory playing soccer when I was really little. And I played soccer all the way up until I went to college. I did some diving in high school, but I was doing strength training to supplement those sports in high school. And that was like my first introduction to strength training, and I hated it. I didn't like it at all. I thought it was really scary. It probably didn't help that it was with the football team, like early in the morning. Like that wasn't helpful for me enjoying the sport. And then once I got to college, I quit both of my sports for different reasons, and then continued just like being a gym rat, and then fell in love with strength training that way. And then during my master's, someone was like, you actually have like reasonably good numbers. We should put you into a meet. I was like, okay, sure, I'll try anything. And I ended up breaking 4 state records in the USPA. And I was like, all right, let's go. I'll keep doing this. I enjoy it. So
yeah. Off the top of your head, do you remember what those numbers were at your first meet?
Oh God, they were terrible. I like look at them now and I was like, I was so proud. And now I'm like, Claire, come on. I think I squatted 215
Mhm.
or somewhere in there. I was like trying to hit 2 plates and I was really excited about that. And then I think I ended up pulling like 150 kilos, maybe.
Okay.
No, that's not right. Maybe 130 kilos.
Mhm.
Yeah. So like now I'm squatting close to 4 and pulling
Mhm.
over 4. And so I like look back and like, that was fun.
Yeah. Was it a
Yeah.
relatively consistent progression from when you did your first competition up until this point? Because, yeah, like you mentioned, you had darn near doubled your squat. So there's not
Yeah.
like you really stalled for long periods of time, I'm assuming.
No, my only stall has been not only, that's not fair. I get stuck at 170 kilos. Like that's
Mhm.
my mental block is 170 kilos. And then recently I've had a back injury that
Mhm.
has been pretty debilitating. It's just been like non-specific low back pain. And for anyone who knows like barbell medicine's like pain shtick, like we just like kept training and found an entry point, and it's just been slow getting back to it, slower than I would have liked. So
Yeah, and this is an aside. I know all kind of pain experiences are different, but I found that just understanding what to do when something like that happens has really helped me, and that I maybe
mhm.
have some sort of like what feels like debilitating pain or discomfort, and then I'll just try to train the next day, and then suddenly it's back to normal within the week, and it's like, holy shit! If I would have taken time off, um, who knows what would have happened? And maybe that's related to the narrative or the training itself. But I think, I owe a lot to Barbell Medicine and clinical
Same.
athlete. Yeah.
Yeah.
And all of the resources they put out. I mean, it's not like, again, it's not specific to them and that it's like
Mhm.
their secret sauce, but they've been able to get it around and to package it in a really, really attractive way.
Mhm.
So a lot of respect there. Um, and then I guess looking at before we dive into the actual topics of the podcast, more specifically, what are your plans heading forward with respect to training? And then are you kind of pursuing any other education or opportunities there?
Yeah. So my next goal with training is I'm competing at 2021 nationals in the 69 kilo class. Uh, I think it's going to be like me and 2 other women competing for the top spot.
Hmm.
So that will be really exciting. And 2 of us are coming back from injuries, which
Hmm.
is it's always fun because you don't know like what everyone's going to be able to put on the table. Like I don't know what I'm going to be able to put on the table in 8 weeks,
Hmm.
10 weeks. Too few weeks for me to know. I don't know yet. I haven't started counting. And then my next goal with my education is actually to pursue a degree in medicine.
Hmm.
So I'm currently studying for the MCAT to retake it, and then we'll pursue that goal
Hmm.
sometime soon. Whenever they let me in, I'm banging on a lot of doors. No one's let me in yet. So
Right. It's actually funny. I don't think anyone who's listening has seen this comment or will have seen it by the time they listen to this, but I saw someone in a comment section of a post say, "Did you do this because of Jordan?" Is that why you're pursuing medicine? Jordan
no,
your mom?
no. I definitely wanted to go to medical school before I knew Jordan, before I knew he existed. Um, when I was in my master's, like I said, I really enjoyed working in the lab with people. That's my favorite part.
Hmm.
And the lab here in San Diego that I was a part of is a clinical lab. And I was like, oh,
Mm.
maybe like this will give me the clinical like interaction that I need to be successful or like happy, and like I'll get what I want out of that without having to completely change careers. And I got into that and I was like, nope, this is still not what I want. I still want that like one-on-one personal interaction working towards a person's goal, not this like nebulous research goal.
Mm.
And working on like large multi-site research studies, you become very anonymous.
Mm.
And like I always felt like the goals of the patients were not actually being listened to because the goal was the research. So I want to pursue a career in medicine because I want to help people pursue their own goals, less so the research side. So
Yeah, and there's definitely nobility in researching because again, like you said, you become so small in that you become a single citation within like a
Hmm.
stream of papers, and collectively, like that makes sense because it forms the take on the subject or the idea or the concept. But individually, it's such a small piece of such a large puzzle that
Hmm.
if you aren't really committed to pumping out a lot of research, or it's like a big study, it could seem kind of lost
Yeah.
in the whole. But
Well, the
working
other thing is that you like take all of this research from all of these populations or all of these individuals, right? You take all this data from all of these individuals and you narrow it down into like one like thesis statement.
right.
And then with that, you lose the granularity that is the human experience. And then but you take that thesis and then you have to reapply it to the human experience,
Mhm.
which makes things really complicated. And so I like the second half of taking the research and being like, all right, does this actually matter for the person that I'm working with? Or is there something else that's more important that we need to focus on first?
Right. No, that's entirely correct. So, with that being said, I guess we can transition into the topics of the show,
Yeah.
which are resistance training or like strength training specific to a female population, and then also looking at the course of the menstrual cycle and that and how that would influence or dictate training if it would. Maybe we could start with gender specific differences in
Hmm.
training, if you think there are any, if you think there should be any changes made. um, I don't know how to refine that question any further, really. It's like,
That's
do you
okay.
think there are any differences between gender, and if we could tuck into what those would be,
Hmm.
and why they are what they are.
Yeah. So I for programming, there's two different sides to this. So for programming and for like the narratives around training, I want to explore a little bit of both. So for the programming side, I don't think that on a population level we should be programming differently for women than men. I think if I was to get a client coming to me, male or female, I'm going to assess their ability level, their goals, and kind of like overall past history to create a training program for them. Whether they are male or female doesn't really matter to me. That said, that partially because, or I say that partially because the variation that we see between each
Mm,
individual person is so large. If you give 100 people the same training program, some people are going to get worse and some people are going to get 60% better. So, and women and men are interspersed between or within that entire sample. So it's not like women are all hanging out at the bottom and men are all like responding really well. So what works for a client is going to be more specific to other things than their gender. That doesn't mean that once we start having individuals who are very highly trained and individuals who maybe have been training for a long time, that we don't see some patterns fall out. And I might not be the best person to talk about what all of those patterns are. Um, I'm sure Greg Knuckles, who you've had on, is much better about talking about those differences that fall out later in training. But because I train mostly like newer powerlifters or people who are just getting into training, and all of my training is based on uh, like what individuals are doing, not like population based, it's hard for me to say like, because you're a woman or because you're a man, I'm going to make this change.
mm,
But that said, when individuals come to me or come to Barbell Medicine, the narratives that they may have been exposed to, depending on whether they are male or female, are drastically different. So men are encouraged to stay active, well, start being active and stay active for most of their lives. So most women stop being active once they hit puberty, or there's a large drop off in women being active once they hit puberty. Women are told a lot more frailty narratives than men
mm.
are. So like, don't lift too heavy, you're going to hurt yourself, or don't look like a man, or which we won't get into how silly that statement is. Or arching is bad for your back when you're bench pressing. And so they've been told, and then the other one that's like super prevalent is also connected to like, don't look like a man, but don't get bulky,
Mm,
or like maintain a feminine figure.
mhm.
And so those kinds of narratives heavily affect how women approach training, whether that means that they're like not interested in strength training or they're afraid of it, or they're just like, they've never been introduced to it. Like most men experience strength training through an older brother or a older male mentor, and most women don't have that. And so sometimes the introduction to training is going to be a little bit different for women or people who maybe haven't had the kind of like support through training as a young individual. So if we look at the kind of problem or issue that happened with the NCAA women's teams this year at March Madness, the women, for those who don't know, the women were given a stack of yoga mats and a tree of dumbbells up to 30 pounds, and the men had a full strength training like conference room. It was a conference room turned into a gym with like squat racks and deadlifting platforms and barbells. So that is like a good, or that is evidence to the fact that there is this disparity, even in high level sports, of how women are treated or how women's sports and women's strength training is valued or not valued. So
yeah, I'd like to take two different approaches to this topic. The first would be changing the narrative within the population you're working with. Is that a relatively like simple process? Is it relatively straightforward? And then for the second part, we'll look at changing everyone else's minds when it comes to this stuff. So with the women you work with specifically, what's it like trying to I guess maybe it's with newer athletes or powerlifters or people who want to get into strength training, less so with people who are well established. But how's it, take when you're trying to explain to them the differences between what people espouse normally and what actually happens?
Yeah. So I think I don't get the people who, so the way that Barbell Medicine kind of gets clients is they've already been exposed to training in some way. So some are already bought in. But I think with the individuals that I do get, sometimes it is trying to get them to understand, like, it's okay for it to feel heavy. I think that's the conversation I have a lot of, like, pushing women to know what it feels like for something to be heavy, especially when they doubt themselves. So I think there's a lot more doubt that I'm fighting. And on a population level, I think I fight this too, of women being like, or just like constantly presenting the narrative of it's okay to be, well, not only is it okay to be strong, it's cool to be strong. And I think I try and fight that publicly. Did that answer your question? Was that along the right lines? Okay.
Sure. And then also with I guess the people who are trying to promote this idea, do you think there is an effective way to get them to stop championing the kind of, I guess you said that idea of frailty, but like on a more population level, not so specific to females who are interested in lifting weights or should be interested in lifting weights or getting them interested in it? How do we change that narrative?
If you know how to change an entire culture shift, right? Like,
Right.
I don't know if I have the answer to that question, but I think the more people we have talking about it, I think there has been a shift over the years. There's more and more women involved in sports ever since Title IX went into effect. But it's going to take a whole culture shift because we are bombarded with these narratives since we were little girls, right? Or like since we were all little. So men have always been, maybe not always, I don't want to use such strong language. Men are often encouraged to, be more active, wrestle with their friends, right? And like girls don't wrestle with their friends. And so I think it's going to take a lot of people continuing to talk about it. The more big names we can get talking about it, and the more, especially so this is more specific to strength training, the more people we can get in strength training talking about it, and the more people we can get outside of strength training also talking about how important it is to help women feel like they can load heavy, and help men understand that like some of the comments that men make are like not helpful in promoting this healthful habit of heavy strength training.
Yeah, and I think just continuing to place the spotlight on women who are very successful and showcase what a lot of training can do. And someone
Hmm.
who comes to mind is like Simone Biles, just continuing to
Yeah.
promote her as a representative because, I mean, she's an incredible athlete. I don't
Hmm.
know much about her as a person, but I'm assuming it's kind of in line.
I hear she's very humble
Mhm.
and like down to earth. So.
Yeah, and then just getting those people again more spotlight, showcasing the variety. I think Sports Illustrated did like a cool body image issue where they had like people in the smallest weight classes up to people in the largest weight classes, and then people from every individual sport, kind of on this like lineup and showcase the differences and what
Hmm.
what might be useful for one sport and what might be useful for another, and the the how acceptable it is to see that and that it's not a
Hmm.
problem or something to be worried about or concerned about. So I think that's definitely going to be tough given the circumstances. You brought up the disparity between the women's organization and the men's organization with respect to basketball. And I personally wasn't aware of that discrepancy, so it's interesting to see that come to light on such a public platform.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't think anyone, I think we all were like not surprised, but having the like very obvious evidence of
Right.
it that
Yeah.
was highlighted by an athlete was interesting, and athlete and coach, I think.
Mhm.
But on top of that, oh, I was going somewhere else with that. I don't remember. We can
Yeah.
continue.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no worries. That'll happen from time to time, and then about 5 seconds from now, it'll just click, and then it'll
I have actually already remembered what I was going
yeah,
to
go
say.
ahead.
So the other thing that kind of affects the way women think about sports or women think about any exercise is the way that it's also portrayed in the media. So
Mm,
something that you were talking about Sports Illustrated and their body image issue. Sports Illustrated, there was a research study on Sports Illustrated and their magazines since the 60s or the 70s, and the kind of athletes that were portrayed. So male athletes were often portrayed, or more often portrayed, doing their sport or in their sports uniform, or like
mhm.
doing something that like directly related to their sports, while women were often placed posed and smiling, which is interesting that what that says about how we value women's sports is that we value women's sports to look a certain way or to like be able to pose in a magazine. I don't know. It's very interesting that like how that kind of played out.
Yeah. Well, and
Uh
you see this loop of this is what is expected, so we give them what's expected, and then it is like this vicious cycle of just kind of self-fulfilling, like a
mhm.
self-fulfilling thing. So you assume that you would want the female athletes to pose a certain way and look a certain way, and then that's what the media would give us, and then that's what we continue to want, and that's what continue to
Mhm.
be fed.
Yeah, yeah.
You have to have some sort of like breaking in point where again you kind of
Mhm.
change that cycle, I guess. And I'm not super clued in on what what all
Yeah.
that means and how to go about it. That's
I'm
kind of
not sure how to go about it either.
yeah,
I'm very good at recognizing that it's a problem.
right.
I think the other thing that, or a argument that we get a lot is that like, oh, women's sports, this is an argument that people tell me as a female athlete, which I always think is funny. They're like, oh, women's sports aren't interesting. And I'm like, okay, cool. And they're like, well, because they're not interesting, that's why they don't get funded. And I was
Mm,
like, or they don't get funded, so you don't hear the
mhm,
stories, and now they're
right.
not interesting to you because there's no story to it. It's just women playing basketball or women lifting weights, when instead these are stories that have a lot of depth to them. And if we learned about these people as people and not objects,
Mhm.
um, they might be more interesting. So,
Yeah, there was actually a funny story that a weightlifting coach mentioned. He was watching the Olympics, I think, or some live event, and they had a race walking segment. And he's like, the story behind the athletes involved, it was so captivating that I really wanted to root for him or get involved with
mhm,
watching that. And it's race walking. It's something that you would assume is just like incredibly boring. No offense if you race walk and that's your thing, but it's it's not as action packed as some other sports, but again, it's building some sort of story behind it. It's getting you involved with the athletes, getting to know them on a personal level, and then getting you and getting the listener or the watcher invested in the outcome. And I think
mhm,
it's like this little story arc that you try to create. And if you're not doing that, it's like why be interested, right? Because
mhm.
you're so unattached to it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think if you look at how we talk about American football, right? The people who are really into I'm not a huge fan of American football. Like, I'll watch it if it's on, but I couldn't tell you I'd have a hard time telling you who won the football games this year. I know Tom Brady has another like ring. But if you like watch the people who are really invested in football, they care about each player and
Mhm,
they know where that player went to
mhm,
college. They know what injuries that player has had and they know like kind of what that player does best. So if we talked about women's sports the same way we talk about American football, women's sports would be a lot more
mhm,
interesting because right now it's just like, oh yeah, and the women are going too, instead of like actually delving into
mhm,
the background. And I think this podcast does that well. There are a couple other podcasts, women's sports, or the women's sports podcast, just women's sports podcast. They're doing that and they're only telling stories about women
mm,
or female athletes. And it's really cool because I didn't know all of this stuff about
mhm.
female athletes. And so there's just the disparities and like women see these things. So they see that and hear that women's sports are not important. And so if they're not important, why would I put in the time or the effort? Instead, I'll do this other thing that garners me support and social capital, and that'll be better for me. So,
Yeah, and I think the UFC is like the Ultimate Fighting Championship is like a good case study of this because they brought in like female fighters a while back and started building stories around their lives. So Ronda Rousey, Misha
mhm,
Tate, Holly Holmes, and you see how much it's developed and grown over time to where there's a huge roster of female fighters, but it's an individual sport, so I think I don't know if that changes the landscape of how you would promote it and then how it can grow
mhm.
versus having some sort of team sport like basketball or I don't know, softball or something like that. I don't know if there's variance there, but yeah, it's definitely a tricky conversation, and hopefully something that changes soon or as soon as
Yeah.
possible. Um,
It's going to take a long time to
right.
like create these changes, but it's happening. There is change happening. It's going to take a long time. So,
Yeah. And then to transition to something that is unique to
mhm.
females and how it would change the training process or um, kind of any of eh, I guess the entirety of their life would be different, and it's something that I'm not privy to because I'm a male, so I'm not able to fully understand it. So I thought it'd be great to have you on to discuss the menstrual cycle, how the narratives are formed and I guess like passed around, if that would make sense, and then what is actually happening and how that
Mhm.
influences the considerations there. So maybe we can start by detailing the actual menstrual cycle itself so
Yeah.
we could have some sort of groundwork to operate off of.
Mhm. Yeah. So there's the menstrual cycle typically lasts on average, this is an average, 28 days. And so the first 14 days is considered the follicular phase. And during the follicular phase starts when a woman starts her menses or starts bleeding. And so that typically lasts for 5 to 7 days. And then the next 7 days is the second half of the follicular phase. The luteal phase is the other phase, the second 14 days in the 28-day cycle. And that is from the point of ovulation. So that starts at ovulation and will go until a woman starts bleeding. So ovulation and bleeding are like on opposite sides of the cycle, and they split the two phases. So during the follicular phase, or the first phase of the cycle, when a woman starts bleeding, your estrogen starts to increase, and it will peak a couple of days before ovulation. And then at the time when ovulation happens, there's a reduction in estrogen. And then during the luteal phase, there's a more gradual increase in both progesterone and estrogen that kind of peak kind of in the middle of that 14-day cycle. Progesterone concentrations are a little bit higher than estrogen during that phase. And other than that, those are like the main things that we're looking at in the menstrual cycle that we're concerned about with training. And the reason that we're concerned about it is that this estrogen peak that happens at the end of the follicular phase is hypothesized to create increases in strength. Mm-hmm. So where this comes from somewhere. So there are studies on rats that look at if you overectomize a rat or take out its ovaries, you're taking away the ability to create like a large portion of its estrogen. So you are chronically depleting this rat or mouse from estrogen, and we're going to see what happens to their strength levels, their muscle size, their ability to recover, and those kinds of parameters, right? And we find that if you overectomize a set of rats and half of them, you give them exogenous estrogen, the ones with the exogenous estrogen do better at strength, muscle size, and recovery. So they're better at all of those. What's important to note in these studies is, one, they are rats. Mm-hmm. They're not humans. Two, this is chronic estrogen depletion that's occurring during this time. And that's a lot different than the estrogen rise and fall that occurs during the menstrual cycle. And for brevity, I'm not going to like list off the numbers of estrogen and progesterone differences because it's more confusing than it is helpful without being able to see them. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to tell you that like estrogen does not reach the levels. So estrogen doesn't get as low during the menstrual cycle as it does when it's chronically depleted. Mm-hmm. And we know this because women also go through menopause. So when a woman goes through menopause, she's also experiencing this chronic estrogen depletion. And we see after menopause that women often are maybe losing muscle mass, losing muscle size, losing strength, which would indicate that that estrogen that we found in rats was also very important in women. What isn't controlled for super well in these studies is that as women age, they become less and less active, and menopause is actually a point at which women become much more inactive than they were previously. So in that way, it looks like it's this estrogen that's making a difference in women's strength training, when in reality, it's the lack of physical activity. So all of these narratives like piled together make it sound like estrogen is this really big, scary thing. And when we have more of it, we're stronger, right? When in reality, that's probably not the case, or not, it's not that clear cut. So the important thing to know with these things is that once we start looking at performance, that's what's important, right? So we want to know, we can say like all of these things are different in like menopausal women or rats, or we do notice estrogen changes across the cycle. But when we measure these estrogen changes across the cycle and match them to the actual strength parameters, we're not seeing those same differences. So hand grip strength, leg extensor strength, power and torque don't change across the cycle, or don't change according to estrogen. There are some changes that are happening across the cycle if we're looking at phase that we see in some women. So there are differences, but they're probably so small, around 5% strength differences, that it's not important, because the changes that we see day to day in programming or in training are probably around 5% or higher, right? Depending on the individual. So once we look at like single muscle joint strength or single joint muscle strength, we see no differences. When we take it out even further to powerlifting, which is typically what I'm looking at, but the squat, the bench press, those have no relation to the ability to produce, or estrogen has no ability to directly correlate with strength in those like whole body movements, right? So there's just so much more going on inside of our bodies, and we're so much more complicated than just saying estrogen equals strong
Yeah,
or
and
higher estrogen equals strong.
when
Go
I
ahead.
guess when you start layering on these aspects of training, so how complex a movement is, how many joints it utilizes, uh, the energy system. Like when you start layering on what training actually is, all these different aspects of it, you see that it's more complicated than just getting like force in and then performance out. Like even just across the board, you can have someone in a meet, they on some sort of like isometric test of force production, they exceed their performance the last training block, so they're objectively in better shape to perform, and then anxiety kicks in, or their technique feels off. So like just establishing that there are already so many different variables that can play into performance. When you look at something that could, even if it did have a very direct influence on force production or rate of force development or some measure like that, it can't correlate one to one. It's just impossible. But I feel like that's just talking about one movement. I mean, if you're talking about a lot of different movements, or things that involve uh, like perception too, and like the kind of the feeling of exerting yourself, that could change just based on how someone feels, their relationships, etc. So it's
Yeah.
definitely a lot more complicated. But what are the narratives surrounding menstruation, and what do women typically think will happen once, maybe I don't know, like when that kind of triggers as like this feeling or sight of it, like the cycle starting, or it's probably using these terms very poorly, but when it actually starts, what's going through someone's head about what's going to happen to performance, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think that depends on the narrative that that woman prescribes to, right? So women who maybe prescribe to this estrogen means I'm stronger idea means that like when a woman would start her period, she would think that like, oh, I'm for the next 2 weeks, I'm stronger, right? I'm increasing in strength for the next 2 weeks. And then the following 2 weeks after that, like a woman guesses. Like most women don't take ovulation tests to know when they ovulate all the time because it's one, expensive, and peeing on a stick is annoying. We don't aim very well. But the that would be like kind of the narrative. And some people have taken this to the research and tried to see like if we train based on this and like increase intensity and not intensity, frequency during these first 2 weeks during the follicular phase, does that create increases in strength? And the answer is no, not reliably, right? And the other narrative is like, oh, my period's starting, I feel really crappy, or the week before. So it depends. There's so much variation. It can be really hard to talk about this and actually like gather everyone's experience. But 1 week you might feel really crappy because of it, because of your menstrual cycle. It's typically the week before you start your period, or the week of your period, depending on your symptoms. So then like that can affect training because you feel crappy. Anyone can attest to the fact that sometimes training just doesn't feel good. And there are migraines associated with that, and there are cramps, both of which can, I don't want to train when I have those things. But I think the biggest issue is that women understand this is all variable, but I think the narrative that happens a lot is, oh, this happened to me, it must be happening to you too.
Right.
And that reapplication of a diagnosis or reapplication of this idea to someone else isn't ultimately helpful. So I like to have women who are experiencing these things. Like I've gone through this process with a lot of women now of like, okay, so what are you doing outside of training that we can use to maximize your ability to train? Are you sleeping enough? Are you eating enough? And typically the question is, are you eating enough? Not correctly, or like too much. So are you eating enough, and are you able to like manage stress as reasonably as you can? And do you have good training programs? If you can say like yes to all 4 of those questions, and this has been going on for a long time, typically barbell medicine uses RPE almost exclusively. I don't currently have any clients who don't use RPE. So if RPE isn't covering it, then we might have a conversation about what we can do the day of training that you feel really crappy. And I don't want to invalidate anyone's experience by just saying it's because you feel really crappy. Like these symptoms can be intense. But for brevity's sake, we're going to continue with the feel really crappy. So if you feel really crappy, what can we do to like change training slightly so you still get all of your training in, or you get all of the volume in that you need without significantly impairing your ability to like make gains, right? So if you just don't train for a day, it's probably fine, but we don't want to do that every month, right? So if that happens every once in a while, fine, chalk it up to a bad day. But what if we just move training a day? So around this time of the month, if you need that, that's fine. What if we let if RPE is working, let RPE dictate the weight on the bar, and that band at which we can, or the band in which we can create adaptation is quite wide. So we can just change training to be a little bit different for a day or a week. It doesn't have to be this narrative of there's this current narrative that drives me nuts, but like do strength and power and endurance training the first 2 weeks of your cycle and then do yoga the second 2 weeks. I'm like, no, that's the terrible idea. You're ruining everything. And I think the biggest issue is that a lot of people who are talking about these narratives in this way either have something to sell or something to prove. And so recognizing what people's biases are before you like buy something from them is really important. So if somebody's telling you you need to train according to your menstrual cycle and they're selling programs that are like training around your menstrual cycle, you should be like, wait a second, you seem like kind of bought into this narrative for a monetary or a financial reason. But
yeah, from a male coach perspective, I've had this conversation a couple times recently because one, I'm interested in it, and two, I knew I'd have you on the podcast to discuss it. But I get different narratives. One is similar to the first one you talked about, where hey, I feel like I'm going to be really strong at this point. We should really push training. If we say that that's like narrative A, how do you approach something like that? Do you try to change it at all in a way where it's not so much focusing on when you will be strong, or when we should dictate the hardest point at which we train, or do you try to program towards their narrative? So do you try to change it, or do you try to program towards how they feel?
Yeah, I definitely try and change it as much as I can. Like there's only so much you can do right off the bat, right? So you have to meet people where they are. So I have a client who wanted to train around her menstrual cycle, and I was like, that's fine, we can do that. But here's what the research says, why this is maybe not great, but I'm willing to try it if that's something you want to try. And after like a month, she was like, it's too hard to try and line this up. And I was like, yep, it is too hard. I agree. I appreciate that you've come to that conclusion on your own. um, I think that narrative ultimately says you have a strong phase and a weak phase. And I am very much against the idea of ever using the word weak for anything, because athletes easily and readily take up that word as part of their self-concept. And I don't ever want an athlete to be like, I have a weak phase. I'm like, no, you have nothing weak ever. Like, let's assume you're going to be strong until proven otherwise. And so that's typically kind of the narrative I try to change it into, because also if a client goes into the gym and they're like, I'm going to be strong today, and I don't know, maybe traffic was really hard on the way to the gym and you had a really stressful day at work and you fought with your significant other 2 nights ago, and then training doesn't go well because of all of those other stressors in your life, you're like, oh no, what's happening? I'm supposed to be strong right now. It can definitely mess with how we think about ourselves as athletes. So
Yeah, well, I think it's important to realize for people listening that you didn't just invalidate what they were saying. You explained why it could be somewhat illogical, but you came on the back end of that and tried to implant something that could replace that narrative, right? So
yeah.
it's like, hey, this is maybe why that's not the best way to think about things. Here's what I know and what the research I've seen says. Because if you're just trying to debunk someone's feeling or narrative, it's like, well, what do they take hold of after that? You have to find something to replace it so that they can make sense of what's going on, or try to make sense of what may not be going on.
Yeah, that's a really good synopsis of my ramblings. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And then I guess another one, and you actually touched on this a little bit, but it's that, hey, I know when I train during my period, the cramps aren't too bad, and I can I can get through it pretty easily. I just kind of once I start training, I start to feel better. And that, to your point, I guess kind of obviates the variability from person to person. So I guess, how would you approach someone who's like, hey, this is the way I feel, therefore everyone feels this way? And that's across the board. I mean, that's with everything with respect to training.
Yeah, that one's harder because I I think mostly I run into this narrative on social media. And so my first goal is typically to be like, hey, let's remember that there's a lot of variability in training. Like, not everyone has this experience, but I'm really thankful that you're willing to share your experience so that other people can also learn from it. And it's like a hard line to walk of, your experience is important and I want other people to see it. But remember, not everyone is going to respond the same way as you do. So
Yeah, and again, that's with a lot of things that are circulating around the training process. Not even within the training process, that's everything. So some sort of medication, like side effects. I mean, with diets, particularly like adherence to diets and stuff like that. Yeah, and then I guess, what does and again, you kind of touched on it, but just to go on a little bit more, what does a good program look like that does take into consideration these fluctuations, either from um, some specific time of the month, or from life stressors, or from nutritional habits or sleep habits, et cetera, et cetera?
yeah, so a good program needs to be specific to the sport you're competing in. It needs, or should be, specific. It should be repeatable, so you can do it week to week, as in it's not so exhausting that you can't repeat it again the following week, and repeatable in that you can do it but progress it. And then it should be recoverable. So kind of in the same vein of, you should use some kind of auto regulation, whether that's reps in reserve or RPE or session RPE or something else. There's other ones that I am not as well versed in. Those are like the big three that I use. And saying like, these are the important things, or these things are important to help you be successful in training. Those are like the big programming things that we want. And then for sleep, like, you should be sleeping 7.5 to 8 hours a night. And then nutrition, I think with the narrative that I run into a lot with women, especially in a weight class sport, is trying to get smaller. And I always caution women to be like, why don't you, if you're at a healthy weight because it's barbell medicine, like we also are conscious of health outcomes as well. I'm typically like, let's focus on making sure you have enough energy to complete a workout and you're eating enough to complete a workout. And instead of like constantly trying to cut down to a lower weight class, I think a lot of women are afraid of cutting or going up a weight class, which if you're gaining muscle might happen. I've gone up 2 weight classes since I started powerlifting. So I think those are the big things that I worry about with programming and training.
Yeah,
Eating enough.
I think sleep. Well, I think sleep is a very simple topic to broach because everyone sleeps and everyone kind of experiences sleep the same way. Insofar as like you close your eyes, you wake up, and like whatever happens in
There's
between, like
some
varies. But
nebulousness that happens there. Yeah. I
Um,
close my eyes and then eventually I no longer am awake. I
Right.
don't know how that happens.
I think with nutrition, though, it's actually more difficult. And it's more difficult because, one, there's the narrative around body weight, but then there's the narrative around good and bad foods. There's
Oh,
the
God.
narrative around chemicals. There's the narrative around organic and like there are so many things that play into nutrition that can preclude someone having a nutritious, healthy diet, however you would
Mm-hmm.
kind of define those terms, and then also eating for performance, which would be like maintaining a slight surplus of weight beyond the weight class,
Mm-hmm.
within kind of striking distance, optimizing fat-free mass, etc. But from a male perspective, trying to communicate that to a female, I found it more difficult. So, one, maybe you could just give advice with respect to talking to women about it, but also from a male perspective, maybe how that topic could better be discussed.
Yeah. So for full disclosure, I actually don't do nutrition coaching with my clients. I only do programming. But as a female athlete who does have to care about her nutrition, there are some things that have been helpful. So whenever I talk to Jordan is still my coach. So whenever Jordan and I talk about my training, we never talk about what I look like. There are like, he never comments on my body shape or size. And it's always a very short conversation. It's like, because I don't pay him for nutrition coaching either. So it's always like, what's your weight? I tell him, he's like, okay, maybe we need to like make this change. And then that's it. But I think for most people, not focusing on size or is important, right? And I want to say don't focus on weight, but it's a weight class sport, right? So we want to focus on performance. For most women, I actually don't think it's important to cut weight, right? So, and this sounds elitist and I don't mean it to be, but unless you're like competing for nationals or like there's money on the line, it's probably not worth it. Like just show up at whatever weight class you show up at because the PRs that you're trying to beat are your own, right? Unless you think you might win like best lifter, like there are a few cases where I'm like, okay, maybe this is important, but I coach mostly Gen Pop. Like it's less important. But for people who are not coaching Gen Pop or for people who are competing at a very high level, not focusing on actual shape and continuing to focus on performance and yes, staying within striking distance. And if that means that eventually you go up a weight class, that's what that means. And I think a lot of people don't realize how much stronger they're going to get if they go up a weight class. So weight is not directly correlated to strength, but not having to cut every 6 months is also correlated to strength. So
Yeah, and I think you mentioned it, having people avoid cutting. And one thing I've noticed, and that I'm kind of thinking about as you're mentioning that, when people do have a more aggressive cut or they go to a lower weight class and they lose a lot of body fat, they and then they gain the weight back, they kind of romanticize what they used to look like in a lower weight class. And then I think it creates a little dissonance between where they're at and where they were. So I think just avoiding getting super lean for a weight class if it's unneeded, or having some sort of unsustainable standard that you would try and kind of always compare yourself to is important to avoid, because I do hear that a lot because of, again, it's a weight class sport. The idea, just like the generally accepted idea, is that you should always cut down to maximize weight lifted per
Per
pound.
pound.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in reality, I think it just, yeah, again, it keeps people romanticizing about what used to be,
Yeah.
instead of celebrating what will be, or what they can,
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
eventually, or what they will do.
Yeah. I think for me, the biggest thing is always saying, like, I am an individual. I am not a collection of body weight, right? So, like, I am not my body weight. So the PRs that I get are different than the PRs against my body weight,
Mhm.
which has been something that's really important for me
Mm,
to be like, oh, I can squat 180 kilos. Me as a person, not me as a person at
right.
72 kilos can squat 180 kilos. It's like the person is still the same. Our consciousness is still the same. So why does it matter what our body weight was at that point in time? And I know there are going to be people who are like, but pound for pound. And I'm like, but you're a person. You're not a set of pounds. So I don't know. Um, it's all made up and it doesn't matter anyways. So
Yeah, you always remind yourself that it's arbitrary, and it's like,
yeah. Who came up with a 69 kilo weight class? Like,
right.
whose idea was that? That was a terrible idea for a women's weight class, but it's fine.
Yeah, and I think kind of hitting that hour mark, and two things I want to bring up. One's a question. The first is actually what you mentioned before we started recording. It's a fundraiser that you wanted to mention. So maybe you can
Yeah.
talk about what exactly that is and why you wanted me to mention it.
Yeah. So I'm running a fundraiser right now through the rest of April. It's called the Load Women Fundraiser. And it's actually born out of partially like the NCAA March Madness issue with women not having access to strength training, and also women who just maybe aren't encouraged to strength train enough. So it's a fundraiser that is a deadlift competition. So you could pledge against technically whatever lift you want, since this is a weightlifting podcast. But deadlift is easily accessible for the population I typically talk to. But you can either pledge a flat rate against whatever you're deadlifting, or you can pledge pound for or cents per pound.
Mm.
It's very open. I've intentionally left it pretty nebulous so that people can donate what they can if they want to. The money is going to the Women's Sports Foundation, which supports women and young girls getting into and staying in sports across all sports. And then the other half of it is going to be donated to the Perry Initiative, which is an initiative that gets women and girls into science, specifically engineering and orthopedics, which are underrepresented fields for women. So you'll have the link and you can link it in the bio. But people can pledge and then tell me what they pulled and then donate. And for anyone who pledges for anyone who donates and puts in their pull weight, however they end up doing it, they'll be entered into a raffle to win a shirt. So there's a whole bunch of merch that my friend Alyssa made from Little Less Fitness, and so we're doing both together. So
Yeah, awesome. And you said it's through the rest of April,
through the rest of
and
April.
the link will have all of the specifics in case
Mhm.
people are interested in reading more. Okay,
Yeah,
awesome.
for sure. The link has more. My Instagram has a post on it, and I post on it like at least once a week, if not 3 or 4 times a week. So
Awesome. That sounds
awesome.
great. And for people who are interested, I mean, everyone knows how to deadlift. You literally just, are there any like standards you're using? Just lock out, it's just kind of like
Yeah.
lift the weight.
It's kind of done on the honor system because I don't have the time to watch
Mhm.
however many thousands of videos people would send me. So it's a little bit on the honor system that you're telling me you deadlifted what you deadlift, and it's a little bit on the honor system that you donate what you say you were going to donate. Because I also don't have time to like go through and check everyone's donations. And if people forget, that's okay. We just want people to be involved and help raise money for these these two organizations and raise awareness about women's like lack of access to strength and conditioning implements and like resources. So
Yeah, and again, everyone can deadlift. I don't think it takes a genius to figure out how to pull the bar from the ground to the hip. And I could be
yeah.
wrong, but
Yeah. I mean, I taught my mom to deadlift using a watering can. So and we just filled
awesome.
it with more water.
Yeah,
So
very cool. And then the last question, I actually started this 2 episodes ago, I think, but it's having you divulge one detail about yourself that no one knows but isn't related to lifting weights. So a good example, I had Madison Pinnell on, and she mentioned that her front 4 teeth are fake.
oh my God,
Um,
that was what I was gonna say.
yeah.
My front teeth are fake too.
No. No.
Yeah.
No.
Uh-huh.
Okay, I
Yeah.
can't believe it.
Yeah, I ran into a car door when I was headed to my interview here in San Diego and broke my front teeth and went to my interview with my teeth not attached.
Wow.
That's so funny. Okay, I'll figure something else out. Oh God.
I literally thought you were just trolling me.
No, I'm not trolling you at all. My front
Yeah.
teeth are fake.
That's awesome.
It must be a strong woman kind of thing.
Yeah.
Oh God, that's my go-to for everything. Dang it.
Yeah,
I don't
anything
know if I
really.
have a better one.
Any other interests besides like performance
Yeah.
and strength training and stuff?
Yeah, I really enjoy photography. I'm trying to get into photography right now, and just like learn more about it. But it's a very expensive hobby.
Yeah.
Camera lenses are expensive. Like going out and taking pictures doesn't cost any money. But once you're like, oh, but I want this lens, and then you're stuck and you're like, ah, here we go again.
Yeah, I did
So
notice that a lot of your pictures are very professional. Did you like
I have taught
have,
my boyfriend how to take
gotcha.
photos. So I'll set up all the settings and I'll tell him what I want, and then he just clicks the shutter while I move in
Yeah.
front of the camera.
Awesome.
So
Yeah, they look great. They're
thank
actually
you.
like really professional. And I didn't steal this idea and you didn't originate it, but like posting a really nice photo and then having like a useful caption. Um, I did that today after I saw your post where it's like you
Thanks.
standing there and then talking about, useful topic. I don't remember exactly what it was. Um,
Shame.
I know, but
Oh.
oh, gotcha. I was like,
Yeah, shame.
yeah, I feel bad. Sorry.
Oh no, it was about shame.
Where can people find those pictures and those posts and then your lifting if they're interested?
Yeah, so all of that is on my Instagram. That's the fastest way to get a hold of me if you don't have my phone number, which I'm not giving you because there are creepy people in the world. So it's Claire_Barbell Medicine. And then you can, through a roundabout way, if you're interested in coaching, you can get in contact with me through the Barbell Medicine page, their actual website, which is barbellmedicine.com. And then the other way, yeah, those are the two main ways to get a hold of me. I'm not very active on Twitter, so
Yeah.
I'm a bad scientist.
Right. Do we have anything else to look forward to in the next few months, few years from you, besides obviously trying to get into medical school?
Yeah, medical school. I would love to go to Worlds. That would
Yeah.
be like the big goal. There's some really strong lifters in the 69 kilo class, and it'll be really fun to see what nationals holds this year because none of us have ever competed at this weight. So
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I think everyone, including myself, will be interested in seeing that happen.
Thank you.
And seeing how things unfold. And for people listening, you can follow the links in the description to either get involved with the fundraiser or to follow Claire on her Instagram and keep up with all things Claire Zai. You can follow me at Josh_PhilWL. You can follow the Barbell Club at Clintonville Barbell. You can stalk me in whatever way you'd like. Just don't tell me about it. And I guess we'll catch you guys on the next episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.